below the tip would symbolize what the 89th Congress was all about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator George McGovern was a decorated World War II hero, receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross as a result of his 35 missions over Germany. He served in the United States Senate from South Dakota from 1963 to 1981. He was a candidate for president in 1968, 72, and 84. Senator McGovern was the nation's first Food for Peace program director under President Kennedy, and more recently served as United Nations Global Ambassador on World Hunger. He has written Grassroots, an autobiography of George McGovern. He is currently a teacher and a lecturer. And Senator McGovern is one of my personal heroes because his passion and courage really brought millions of young people to participate actively in politics. Senator, a photo of the two of us hangs on the wall over my desk, and I looked at it this morning. I'll tell you, we looked a lot younger then. But please welcome Senator George McGovern.
Well, thank you very much, Joan Grow. It's wonderful to be introduced by a woman who held the office of Secretary of State in Minnesota for 26 years in what we used to call a man's world. But John Culver's wonderful story about his 4-year-old daughter's farewell prayer to God perked my mind on an incident involving a 4-year-old daughter of mine, Terry McGovern. I was the Adlai Stevenson coordinator for South Dakota in 1952. And shortly after that campaign, Eleanor and I were sitting in our living room in Mitchell, South Dakota, a beautiful sunny day. The window was open. And we heard Terry's little 4-year-old friend from next door, the son of the Lutheran minister, say that his 3 favorite people were his dad, his mother, and his little sister. Terry, not to be outdone, said, "Well, they're not my 3 favorite people. My 3 favorite people are God and Jesus and Adlai Stevenson." I told that story to Adlai at a Chicago hotel a few weeks later, and he said, "Well, it's a wonderful story, George, but I don't think you and I could market that version of the Holy Trinity." I might say, under my leadership in the South Dakota Stevenson campaign, we took that campaign to a 2-1 defeat in November. It helped get me ready for the Democratic presidential candidate 20 years later, 1972. I want to just add another word about John Culver. As Joan Gross said, he has written a biography of Henry Wallace. Wallace is one of the kind of forgotten figures in American politics, but when I was in graduate school at Northwestern University right after World War II, a poll was taken at that time of history majors in graduate schools across the country and history professors as to which American most resembled Thomas Jefferson. Henry Wallace won, hands down. And we need to remember that aspect of this great man, which John Culver does so well. This is a balanced book. It's not an apology. It's not a hatchet job. it should have had, in my opinion, the Pulitzer Prize as the best political biography of its time. And I hope all you students will one day read that great biography. It has a wonderful title, American Dreamer. Sometimes people scorn the dreamers in politics, but as Michael Beschloss, who's written these great books about contemporary politics, points out, Lyndon Johnson had a dream of a great society. A lot of people scorned the great society. Hubert Humphrey used to get that kind of scorn sometimes, but I remember him telling a South Dakota audience one time, I'm sometimes, he said, attacked as a do-gooder. Yes, I'm a do-gooder. What's wrong with doing good in the world? The greatest soul ever to walk this earth was a man who went about doing good. I'm proud to be a do-gooder. I'm proud to be a dreamer, he said. And I think that's one of the things that's painfully missing from our politics today. Charlie Ferris, who we depended on to tell us how to vote on issues that we hadn't been able to listen to on the Senate floor, has pointed out the dreams of Lyndon Johnson. I myself heard him say one day he wanted to be known as the civil rights president. Another time he said, I'd like to be known as the education president. A little bit later, I want to be known as the Medicare president. We didn't know it at the time, at least I didn't, but he hated that American war in Vietnam. And you read Professor Breslau's book on the Johnson tapes, and you'll see how he despised that war. He seemed unable to figure out how to gracefully get out of it, and so that blurred these dreams he had. But when I recall those words of Johnson's dream, I get a kind of a sad feeling about it, first because of the way the war destroyed some of his hopes, but also because it seems to me today we have a president, and I don't say this in a partisan way. I want every president to be a success. That's a selfish thought on my part. I'm an American who believes this is the greatest country on the face of the earth, so naturally it's in our interest to want every president to succeed. But one thing that concerns me about this president, it seems to me almost from the beginning, he has relished the job as commander-in-chief of the armed forces above every other function of the presidential office. Now, we want a great commander-in-chief, of course, but I wish there was a little more concern demonstrated both at the White House and in the Congress on most days in the kind of issues and battles that we were waging in the 89th Congress. If there's any one word that describes that 89th Congress, it was the word liberalism. This was at a time when liberals were not as scorned as they are today. But let me make one central point here today. Every single forward step in the life of this country was made after a liberal initiative over conservative opposition. That's the way it began, whether you're talking about Medicare or Social Security or minimum wages or aid to education, whatever. Every one of those initiatives going back to the days of Thomas Jefferson were liberal initiatives over conservative opposition. Now, that doesn't mean that conservatives don't have an important role to play. They do. They used to do things like argue for a balanced budget. They used to say that we shouldn't spend money we didn't have. They used to be cautious about committing American forces abroad unless there was no other honorable course. Those things seem to have fallen by the wayside with the kind of extreme elements that prevail too often today. But we need a strong conservative tradition in the United States, just as we need a strong liberal tradition. I've always thought that the genius of American politics is the creative tension between the liberal tradition on one hand and conservatives on the other. And I understand these old-fashioned conservatives. My mother and father lived and died as conservative Republicans. Whether they would have voted for me in 1972, I don't know. I've always thought that maybe in that one case, sentiment might have prevailed over logic. But liberals, it seems to me these days, the kind of liberals that made that 89th Congress possible, great people like Walter Mondale, and he and Joan are the epitome of a public-spirited couple that have given their lives to the service of the country. John Culver and Charlie Ferris, these were people who did not scorn the conservative tradition, but who believed if you wanted to get things done in America, you began with a liberal sentiment. Just now, and maybe a great historian like Michael can correct me on this, but I can't think of a single time when we had a big forward step in America that began as a conservative initiative over liberal opposition. There were times when the conservatives led, but if they had reasonable proposals, usually the liberals supported it. There may be exceptions to this, and I'll stand corrected if someone can come up with a single one. In any event, the great tragedy of 1965 and 1966, the years of the 89th Congress, is that that's when we had a time bomb ticking in the background. All these wonderful measures rolling through with the leadership of Lyndon Johnson and Michael Mansfield, and sometimes with the help of Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader. One measure after another. It's just almost dizzying to read the list of things that the Congressional Quarterly has pulled together of what happened in this tremendous burst of constructive legislation. But in the background, ticking away, was that time bomb, our involvement in Vietnam. I think, if my memory is right, I made my first speech against our involvement in Vietnam on September 23rd, 1963. I was a brand new United States Senator. I honestly thought in those early days of dissent that I would probably be a one-term senator, but I decided to make the best of it. And it seemed to me that that war was the looming issue that one day would overshadow all others. Shortly after that speech, John Kennedy was killed, and I decided the appropriate thing to do was to be silent on Vietnam with a new president coming in until after the '64 elections, and then the war began to accelerate. Large contingents of American forces sent. You know all the rest of the story. Within 3 years, the man who had won that landslide victory in 1964 announced that he would not run again. I don't think there's any doubt that that was one of the casualties of the Vietnam War, and brought Richard Nixon to power, a man that I didn't entirely approve of. But one of the things my friend Adlai Stevenson said is that a wise man does not attempt to hurry history. A wise man does not attempt to hurry history. I think I violated that every stage of my career. I was always running for something that people thought was premature. And I thought the time had come for Mr. Nixon to be retired in 1972, but I missed by 18 months. He was retired in 1974 on August 9th. Well, I don't know what that has to do with the 89th Congress, but it's what I wanted to say today. I'm so grateful, Walter, for you putting this program together. I met Jane Freeman earlier today. She's just as beautiful as ever, a wonderful husband, and Orville Freeman, a great governor, a great Secretary of Agriculture, Gene McCarthy, John Blotnick, Don Fraser, Eugenie Anderson, Joan Grove. All these great people have been a great inspiration to South Dakota. Politics is tough over there in South Dakota. And by the way, Walter, South Dakota is west of Minnesota here. So come and see us someday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thanks to all of our panelists. We're going to take a 10-minute break. I think there's coffee out in the lobby, so grab a quick stretch and come back quickly. Thank you. We're ready to begin. And that means you're supposed to stop talking right away, immediately. You forgot who was in charge. Thank you. There's a good way to get people to stop talking. Because we ran over a bit this morning, we're going to extend our program by 15 minutes and go until 12:15. Mr. Betschloss and Mr. Ferris have planes to catch, so they're going to get up and leave at noon, and so it has nothing to do with what anyone said. But we don't want them to miss their plane, or they'll leave with bad feelings and not come back to Minnesota. So we're going to begin the first part of this afternoon or this morning's program by letting our panelists interact with each other or ask questions of each other or challenge each other. And then at about 11:45, we're going to take a half an hour and have questions from the audience. So do you want to start? Yes.
Can everyone hear? I guess these are working. We're here in the Humphrey Institute, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about Hubert Humphrey's role in the legislative successes, especially of 1965. So anyone who can give us a little field experience?
Hubert was always active on the peace front. Food for Peace was really his baby. He was talking about that before the Office of Food for Peace was created by President Kennedy, and I became the first director. He was the instigator of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which was passed into law. He was one of the initial sponsors of the Peace Corps. He was always an advocate of a more liberal and open trade policy in the Senate. Of course, we all know his central role in civil rights. I just got a copy of his 1948 speech at the Democratic National Convention, the one where he says we have to walk out the darkness into the sunlight of civil rights and human rights and so on. But I think those were the areas that were very close to his heart. He was one of the initial sponsors of the Occupation Health and Safety Act. And one day he came to Huron, South Dakota, where he was a part owner of a drugstore that had been in the Humphrey family forever. And there was an inspector from the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, just by coincidence, who was at the store when Hubert came in. And he decided to give this guy a tour of the store, and he said, "Why don't we start with the basement?" And so when they came to the door to go down to the basement, the door wasn't high enough to let you through. You had to bend down. If you weren't careful, you'd hit your head on this sharp-edged door. And the inspector said, "Senator, you got to correct this. Somebody's going to crack their head on this doorway here." Hubert says, "Well, they wouldn't do it more than once, would they?" But they wanted him to get a safer back door. They wanted another exit in the drugstore. It wasn't as big as Walmart's. It was just a little store, but they wanted another exit, and they went through a whole litany of things. At the end of the thing, Hubert said, "If I'd known what you guys were going to do with this act, I never would have sponsored it in the first place."
It seems to me that Humphrey was perhaps the most persuasive, persistent apostle of the use of the federal government as an instrument of social justice for the better part of 4 decades in America. There are many others that agreed with him, but he was the best of all auditorium speakers. And he had this in his spirit, his soul. And it came from his faith, it came from his parents, it came from his experiences. But you read any of his speeches, you read any of the bills he's in, there was a persistent, almost obsessive attention to trying to remove things that hold people back unfairly, things that are beyond that individual's power to solve himself. And that's why civil rights, he grew up in South Dakota and then in Minnesota, but he was the national spokesperson for civil rights in this country. Every civil rights leader looked to Humphrey. And after Humphrey was defeated for president, Clarence Mitchell, the NAACP lobbyist, wore a Humphrey for President button around the Senate for a full year because he was still for Humphrey. And that speech he gave at the 48 convention is what cracked the ice. That's what moved the previously unmovable, large sort of machine organization states towards civil rights. Not because they wanted to do it, but Humphrey showed they had to do it. And he kept that up throughout his life. I mean, it was my tremendous blessing to have worked with Humphrey through all of this stuff. And I would say the high point was the Voting Rights Act, because as Charlie points out, they went right down to the tail. But as we talk about the high tide, this special moment, it didn't just happen. It happened because many people over a long time argued almost this spiritual case for why we as Americans should help other Americans have a better chance. give those kids a better education, stop this horrible racial discrimination and abuse, stop the shame of only allowing Western Europeans to gain legal immigration into the United States. Just the list is long and hard. But Humphrey was in the middle of all of that. So if you look at specifically what he did, it's true. But I think it was that incredible centrality of his commitment, lifetime devotion, and his genius to the idea of using the federal government as an instrumentality of social justice. That was his greatest contribution, and that's what's missing today. And I think this country really needs it.
First, I want to just take a minute to ask you a question, but I'll preface it by saying that when I went to Washington in 1956 as a new congressman, Hubert called me up right after the election and said, George, there's a house for sale right next to mine in Washington. It's been occupied by an admiral, and he just got transferred to Seattle, and he wants to sell that house. It's almost identical to mine, and I recommend you get it. I said, well, Hubert, how much is it? He says, oh, it's only $25,000. I said, Hubert, I haven't got $25,000. I've got a campaign debt, but I don't have any personal money. He said, well, I'll help you get a mortgage with the Riggs Bank. Anyway, we moved into that house. We bought it over the telephone. And for the next 10 years, we lived right next door. Our lawn ran right into to his, and it was one of the great experiences of my life to be broken in to the Washington scene by Hubert Humphrey, who was already a much admired senator. The only complaint I had when I was with Hubert, I always felt like I was slow and tongue-tied. And I'm wondering if you ever felt that way.
I remember one of Humphrey's frustrations was that when the 89th Congress came along with these huge majorities, he was no longer a member of the Senate. He was the presiding officer, but he wasn't in the Senate anymore. And we were passing things left and right. And I remember one afternoon about 3 o'clock, we went into the Senate dining room. There were 4 or 5 young senators with us there. And Humphrey, the vice president now, was sitting nearby. And I said in a loud voice, I said, you know, Humphrey's been going all over my state for years, talking about how we need this bill and that bill and this farm program. And I said, nothing happened. And I said, here I've been here 3 months, and we just adopted every bit of it. And oh, Humphrey came flying out of the chair.
I always felt that Hubert Humphrey was a man of the 60s, in the 40s, in the 50s, and in the 60s. And the great thing was, he was a man of the 60s and came to his peak of his power at the time when his ideas could be put into law. It was just a marvelous accident of history, but I worked with him on '64 on the Civil Rights Bill because he was the manager of the bill, and no one had more energy than Hubert Humphrey. That was just a classic piece of legislation from the standpoint of putting together coalitions. I mean, Hubert Humphrey never met a person he didn't like, and never was there a meeting he didn't want to attend. And he had meetings all the time with Clarence Mitchell and Joe Rao and anyone. But the schemes that were put together were marvelous. I mean, Karl Mundt, would be, should we get Karl Mundt to vote? Can we get Burke Hickenlooper to vote? And it would be, he goes to work at 9, and we know his wife is for the legislation. So let's call at 9:15 when he's not there and talk to the wife, and we'll convince her and get her to talk to him. I mean, it was these intrigues, and he loved every one of them. And I think everyone in the Senate was subjected to that type of a mechanical approach, but he was marvelous. He was a great human being.
Wonder if I can ask, at the same time he had this extremely difficult, to probably put it most politely, relationship with Lyndon Johnson, who I guess you couldn't say that he liked everyone he ever met. LBJ was oftentimes very heavy-handed.
Lyndon proves the rule.
Yes, that's right, the exception that proves the rule. In retrospect, was it better for Humphrey to have gone with Johnson as his vice president, or could he have been better serving his values and ambitions staying in the Senate?
My personal belief is that the vice presidency was the worst mistake Humphrey made. That while he was closer to becoming president, he lost his independence, his ability to be his own leader, his own spokesperson. And Lyndon, for all of his strengths, was very cruel, almost sadistic. Sensing that Humphrey was now dependent upon President Johnson, he would diminish, humiliate Humphrey. And I think, and then of course as the war came on, he kept getting Humphrey out there to do the cheerleading. And I think it was just a horrible 4 years for Humphrey. Whereas if he'd stayed in the Senate, he would have been frustrated because he always wanted to be president. From I think the 3rd grade, but no, I think you'd have to say the impact of the vice presidency was a very bad thing on Hubert in his life. And when you read Humphrey's book carefully, he almost says that.
We in Iowa used to be so appreciative of Hubert Humphrey because for so many years during his time in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, we didn't have much representation in the Congress, and it was always a treat when he would come. And later, Vice President Mondale used to play the same role for us when we were a little light on Democrats. I was born in St. Mary's Hospital at Mayo Clinic. My grandmother came from Sweden to Aiken, Minnesota. My parents were married here in Minneapolis, but when I was born, I looked around in that maternity ward, and there was Don Fraser and Fritz and Orville Freeman and Humphrey, and I decided if I want to get in politics, I better go back to Iowa or something. But I remember he would come down, and he used to talk quite a long time. But we were so hard up, we'd love to hear all kinds. And I remember particularly in 1976, he came to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and was speaking on behalf of Jimmy Carter, who was running against, of course, Gerald Ford. And at one point in the speech, he said, because he was nice to everybody, he said, well, I've known Jerry Ford for many, many years, and I know they say Jerry Ford's a nice guy. And I want to tell you, he is a very nice guy. But so is my Uncle Fred, and he'd be a bad president of the United States.
If I could ask another question, and that is that, looking back to what happened in Vietnam, I think probably most people would say that what Johnson should have done in the spring of 1965 was pull out, given what the cost of that war was. But I think at the same time, this would not have been cost-free. One thing that Johnson was worried about was that if he pulled out of Vietnam in the spring of '65, which he never considered seriously, but this is what he presumed, if that happened, the conservatives would go after him, and his position, especially in Congress, would be weakened, and he could not get those Great Society programs passed that we were talking about today. And I guess my question is, what do you all think would have happened had Johnson done that in '65?
I think Johnson was very, I've always felt, it's always a speculation, what if in history are endless. And I always felt quite confidently, knowing President Kennedy, that he would have cut his losses and gotten out. He opposed the French in Algeria, and he understood, I think, and was more inclined, even though he did support the buildup. And I think he had the political courage to do that based on his own war experience, his own war record, where he had distinguished himself in World War II. I think, on the other hand, Johnson, having not had a similar military experience and background, being a Texan, the Alamo, who lost China debate was very much in his thinking, I think, as a congressman and senator and so forth during that period, the McCarthy period. And I think he was determined not to be the first president to lose a major war and so on. And I think that political and personal insecurity and obsession overwhelmed any more rational addressing that issue. That would be my opinion.
John, just to support that point, it's very interesting. An anecdote that Mike Mansfield told me, he went over to Vietnam in 1962 on a mission and came back and wrote a report. Matter of fact, part of it was in his commencement address at Michigan State. And he wrote this report and he brought it down to the president. And he said he brought it down to the president in Palm Beach. And they went out on the Honey Fitz. And President Kennedy apparently was one of these Evelyn Waugh speed readers. He was very fast reader. So he had Mansfield's report, and Mansfield was sitting there. And Mansfield, he's going through this report, and Mansfield says his neck starts getting red because he was reading what Mansfield was telling him. And he finishes the report, and he said, turns to Mike, and he said, Mike, this is not what my people are telling me. And Mansfield said, well, Mr. President, he said, I'm just giving you my honest opinion. Now, this was in the fall of 62, late fall 62. In the spring of 63, Mansfield was down at the White House after a leadership meeting, and Kennedy called him over and said to him, Mike, I've come to the conclusion that you're right and my guys are wrong. But I can't do anything until after 64 because Barry Goldwater is going to be my opponent. Now, to me, the assassination has a whole new dimension. Kennedy had come to the conclusion that that was the case. And he did have the confidence to say to the advisors, no. He could tell Mac Bundy and Walt Rostow and Dean Rusk. He could say no. I think Lyndon Johnson's problem was he had all of these advisors who were Kennedy's advisors, who were pushing him, and he did not have the confidence to say no. And I think that's the tragedy. I listened to the tapes that you published, and I just turned around my opinion on Lyndon Johnson. I'll tell you one more anecdote, which I think is very, very interesting. This was told to me by Jim Woolsey, who was the former CIA director. He said that in 1954, Eisenhower had a report, the recommendation when Dien Bien Phu fell, that we were supposed to go in and pick up that mantle. Vietnam was a Catholic country. You know, it was McCarthyism was running rampant. Anything anti-communist you had to do. You know, you had John Foster Dulles at the state and Allen Dulles at CIA all advocating going into Vietnam. Eisenhower had a big, thick report from the agencies what his recommendation was. They say apparently Eisenhower only read one pages. So they had the one-page summary on top. He looked at it, but he decided he was going to call his friend Matt Ridgway. So Matt Ridgway, who had just returned from Korea, he calls him over to the White House, and Ridgway comes in. This story, Woolsey said, came from the Ridgway side of the family. He said Eisenhower was putting in the Oval Office, and Ridgway comes in and he said, Matt, do you read that stuff on going into Vietnam? And Ridgway said, yes, Mr. President, I have. He said, would you send your favorite sergeant into that country to fight? Apparently, this is how generals used to talk. And Matt Ridgway said, no, I wouldn't want to do it. And Eisenhower said, we're not going in because I feel the same way. Now, here was a guy who had sufficient confidence in his judgment to say no to all of the wealth of the advisors, all the atmospherics of McCarthyism and anti-communism, that he had the judgment to say, the confidence to say no. Johnson didn't have that, I don't think. Kennedy did. And that was the great failing, I think, of Lyndon Johnson, the great tragedy, I think, of Lyndon Johnson.
During the break, a woman came up and said that there are a number of people listening to this discussion outside the room. They couldn't get in, including a man who's in a wheelchair. And his question was, why did it take so long to get out of Vietnam? I think that Charlie and John have done a pretty good job of already answering that question, but I'm not sure all of our fellow Americans know just how long we were involved there. It began right after World War II, in 1945 and 46 when the French wanted to restore their colonial hold in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And because of the anti-communist sentiment that drove American foreign policy above any other consideration in that period and for the next 50 years, we backed the French and were financing 80% of that war, which ended in a failure at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. That would have been another good time to bow out of Vietnam. Both Winston Churchill and General de Gaulle urged us not to get involved as far as our troops were concerned. They knew that we'd been financing the French effort, but they urged us not to put troops there. Churchill later observed, after failing in that position to convince the Americans, said, the only certainty about war is that nothing is certain about war. That's going to be true today, too. No one of us knows what the repercussions are going to be of this invasion of Iraq. We all hope for the best, but none of us know what the repercussions will be. But in Vietnam, first the Kennedy administration and then Johnson made the decision to go in. And I think it's quite true that one of the things that bolstered Johnson, who never thought that he was an expert on foreign policy, he always thought that people like Mansfield and Fulbright could carry that part of the Senate responsibility. But he kept on the entire Kennedy command, Rusk, McNamara, Rostow, Bundy, all the rest, and tried to get the ones that left not to do that, to stay on. So I'm sure that in his mind, he was carrying out what he thought had been the policy of the Kennedy administration. When it became clear to him that that situation wasn't working, there was this problem of how you handle two things. How do you handle the argument that we have to hold the line on communism? Dean Rusk used to tell the Foreign Relations Committee, this is another Munich situation. We gave in to Hitler. We gave up half of Czechoslovakia, and World War II took off from that. And so that was the arguments that were made, and also this argument that Johnson said to a number of people that I'm not going to be the first president to lose an American war. I went to see him right after the '64 election. I'd gone all over the country speaking for the Johnson-Humphrey ticket. I thought it was very important to be elected. But when it became clear after the election they were going to escalate the war, I asked Bill Moyers if I could see the president, and he said, come down tonight at 7 o'clock. And the president started off by saying, you know, George, I've had LeMay in here the last couple of days. You know, he wants to bomb him back to the Stone Age. And he says, Joe Rao and the ADA crowd were in here this afternoon, and they want to pull out. Well, you know I can't do either of those things. I'm not going to bomb them into the Stone Age. And he says, I don't let them bomb as much as an outhouse out there without my approval. And he said, I can't just pull out, nobody reasonable. And he really thought he was following kind of a moderate middle course. And his advisors were telling him, if we just hold the line, we see light at the end of the tunnel and all that sort of thing. But it's very difficult to know why a shrewd political figure as Johnson was couldn't have figured out a way to get out of that war. But the facts are he never could satisfy himself that the way out was one that he could salvage politically.
Our dilemma is we could listen to these gentlemen for another hour or so, but we've promised you an opportunity. So if you have a question, raise your hand. And George, where are you with the mic? Would you when you ask your question, would you give us your name? And then let me just ask everyone, if we are brief with our questions and brief with our answers, we'll get more people
I'm
involved.
Dave Sondag from Lake City, and I would like to have you address the question that our policies seem to be dictated frequently on political expediency. Now, it's fine to discuss all this, but how can we change this in the future and really accomplish something?
That's why I talked about Hubert's biggest contribution flowing from his fundamental commitment for social justice and for civil rights. That wasn't a political expedient. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, it's the same thing. You need to have conviction, and you need to be heard on those convictions. That's essential to the public debate.
But if you're president and you base your activities a lot on future policies on future activities, rather than what you honestly believe.
Well, I serve, absolutely, and when you're dealing with human life, doubly so. I served under President Carter, and we went through some very difficult times, and he made a decision not to become involved militarily, and we had many private talks about it. It may have been more popular to do it the other way, but he told me once, he said, I won't have it on my conscience. And he never did it.
Okay, I think we're going to go to the next question.
Hi, my name is Abdul Almi, and I was hoping to ask, first off, a general question. How do you feel about the Bush administration's steps to undermine your landmark accomplishments in that of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in a challenge more recently of affirmative action? And also, how do you feel about the development of globalization and free trade and how it's correlating with the concept of fair trade?
Maybe we can ask not every panelist to respond to each part of the question, but somebody pick up a piece of it if you want to.
I'll take the domestic side because it was in my remarks. I think that this fundamental high tide of commitment for social justice that made all of these changes that I described is now under direct threat and should be seen as a major challenge to not just a bill, but a fundamental idea about how America works. And I raised the affirmative action thing, which is a controversial thing, but that too is something that we worked out as a nation over a long time to try to do something about people who were just unshackled with the adoption of the Civil Rights Act, who'd been held back for 3 centuries with slavery, to try to give them some chance to become a part of American life and to create education where we learned together. That's why every college president in America, I think, favors the present system. The military spoke out and so on, and I'm sorry that they're making that challenge.
Someone want to comment on the globalization question?
I'll just take a quick shot at that. I'm in favor of expanding trade. On the globalization question, there are 2 provisos I would like to insist on. Number 1, that not be carried out at the expense of workers, that there has to be some kind of scale set internationally that makes it less tempting for corporations in this and other countries to move abroad in order to exploit cheaper labor. That has to be guarded against. And the environmental concern is the other thing that I think needs to be attached to any support for globalization. We can't, again, permit corporations that want to escape the kind of environmental regulations we have here to move their plants into areas that don't give a damn about the environment. So it's going to be difficult to figure out how you set international standards on the environment and the and wage scales, but it has to be done before I can support this move towards globalization.
Thank you. Your question here, I believe, or over there. Go ahead. Yep. You, sir.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm from Highland Park. What, in your experience with being an ambassador to Japan and with the parliamentary system, what advantages and disadvantages did you see with that system for legislation like the Great Society? What are the advantages? Sorry.
Good question.
I was writing it down, but...
No, it was a good question.
Thanks.
I think for the United States, because of our size and the vast scope of our nation, that the system of a strong executive, a president, the system that we came up with fits us. Other nations, almost all of them significantly smaller than ours, have preferred the parliamentary system or some variant of it. And that's true in Japan. They have the Diet, and the leaders of the government are most all of them come out of the Diet. The emperor is just a figurehead, a symbol of the country. It no longer possesses any power. The thing about Japan is that they're such a profoundly consensus-oriented society. Their culture so values harmony and compromise that it tends to be much slower, more evolutionary, more patient, sometimes glacial than our systems. So I'd say you not only look at the system, you look at the culture.
Question here.
My name is Rosemary Foley. I wanted to ask about the question of leadership. There are many people who feel since the loss of Paul Wellstone in Minnesota that there's a real problem with the development of liberal leadership in Minnesota. And there are many people who are sort of unhappy with the level of Democratic leadership at the national level. And I wonder if you could address some of the issues of emerging leadership in the Democratic Party.
Who'd like to take a...
I suggested in my remarks that I, for one, as a citizen and as a Democrat, was extremely disappointed in the failure of the Democratic Party and its leadership to provide a meaningful alternative in the midterm elections. I think the failure to debate on that occasion the war resolution will be viewed historically as a tragedy, because there was a tendency then to get the war resolution off the table, go ahead and vote, put it aside. There was a preoccupation and concern that they wanted to be sure to be safe and so forth. And we'll get it back on the economic issues, which are more favorable to the Democratic Party, they assumed. Well, as we all know, that strategy failed dramatically. It failed because of the preoccupation, in part, understandably, of the American public after 9/11 with the fear and terrorism and so on. It's hard to penetrate with other concerns, but it primarily failed by the failure of the Democrats to stand up and give full ventilation and debate to the wisdom of this decision. The kind of questions, the very same issues that are being raised as we assemble here today about that decision and will be with us for the foreseeable future. And I think that was the failure. I think that at the end of the day, the most important thing is the education of the electorate. Ben Franklin, they tell the story about he left the Constitutional Convention, came down the steps, and a woman approached him and said, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" He said, "Madam, a republic if you can keep it." And what he meant by that, this was this democratic experiment that nobody had ever really even tried for any length of time. And it was based on the assumption that an educated electorate would make informed decisions in the public interest, and similarly insist on their elected representatives to speak out and speak up and stand for these things. I think Paul Wellstone, I'm sure, deliberated painfully, I know he did, from a personal basis about that vote, but he made the decision that he was going to do that because it was right. Those are the kind of leaders that the public has to insist upon. One of my big disappointments in watching the Congress over these years is that we probably never had a more educated Congress in the history of the country in terms of their own education, their opportunities, their experiences. But I'm afraid that potential enlightenment is not forthcoming because such a high percentage dummy down to the electorate based on polls and know better time after time, but to be safe, to get reelected, to stay there forever, regardless of where they contribute anything, is the name of the game. And the public has to challenge that and has to demand and insist that people meet their responsibilities. And again, that is key in education. When we see the participation, so pathetic in this country, it's dangerous, where a handful of people in a primary determine who the governor is going to be, a tragic percentage determine who the presidents are going to be. I mean, we have to, of course, soon it starts all back with education. And that's why I personally am so grateful to see the high school kids here. And at the break, a number talked to me about their interest in politics. I really hope that many of them pursue these opportunities, because nothing is more rewarding and satisfying that you can do with your life than to help, and there are opportunities to help in so many important ways.
Thank you.
John has mentioned the initiatives on the domestic scene. I think in foreign policy, the loyal opposition also has to come up with a positive alternative. If there's any one characteristic of the present administration, it's unilateralism in foreign policy, repudiating the Kyoto Treaty, the Criminal Court, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And I think during the run-up to this involvement in Iraq, treating the United Nations shabbily, treating the French and other countries shabbily because they raise questions about our policy. Most of these foreign policy questions it faces, whether we're talking about globalization or the global environment or security, are issues that require some degree of international cooperation. I hope my party will be out in front on doing what it can to strengthen the United Nations, trying to rebuild relationships with other countries. Right after the September 11th tragedy, I think it's fair to say the whole world was in our court. We got messages of sympathy and offers of support from virtually every country. Today, almost the entire world is opposed to this invasion of Iraq. Not that they like this miserable dictator, Saddam Hussein, but because they felt that he was being contained without the necessity of destroying Iraq, losing young lives on both sides. Some of the things that have been said by high officials of the government about France and about Germany, referring to them contemptuously as the old Europe. I was on an airplane here the other day, and somebody across the aisle handed me a newspaper with a little article circled where it said that the House of Representatives of the United States has decided to remove French fries from the House dining room menu. They're now called freedom fries. I'm not sure whether this means we're going to have to demolish the Statue of Liberty, which was a gift
From the
to this
French.
country from France. John, we may even have to give up the French kiss, which would be.
George, I don't know about you, George, but I haven't even used it for years.
Well,
It's no big loss.
they,
I'm more worried about going blind.
I think
the first time I accidentally discovered it, and my memory goes back far enough that I can think of that. I thought I was in heaven. So I hope we won't carry this anti-French binge too far. We really do need to recognize we live in a world where we're the most powerful country on earth, but we're not the only country on earth. I doubt if we could have won World War II without the alliance that included Britain, France, Russia, China, numerous other countries. And I don't think we can really build the kind of stable, peaceful world we want without greater sensitivity. Thomas Jefferson's great phrase, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. I don't think we've had enough decent respect for international dissent. It might have saved us a lot of problems if we'd listened a little more openly.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there a question up there, George?
My name's Dick Cohen, and wanted to ask a question going back to the civil rights legislation. Michael Beschloss in his histories has talked about how Lyndon Johnson viewed the political consequences privately of the civil rights legislation. I'm curious about the collection of Southern Democratic senators. If they were truly racist, if they thought they were just voting their states back home, and also what they thought privately about the political consequences of what was happening.
I got to the Senate when the old Southern senators were still around. And I spent a lot of time talking to them. There were some senators that I thought genuinely hated black Americans, hated any idea of desegregation, and worse. And there were some on the edges that didn't like it, but felt that coming from that state, they had no choice but to support the existence of the system. And I don't think that was going to change. It hadn't changed for 100 years. It was the one man, one vote idea that was passed by the court. It was the tremendous civil rights energy that the civil rights movement developed, and it was the actions of the court that changed the underlying politics of the South that broke the Southern stranglehold against civil rights legislation. They weren't persuaded, they had no choice but to accept it. And as you know, since those decisions, there's been a big change in the politics in the South that reflects that there's still resistance to these changes. And what was once a solid South democratically is now more solid in a Republican sense.
I want to thank all of you for participating today. Particularly great to see so many students who were here. You've been a wonderful audience, and this has been a wonderful panel. We've learned a great deal. We appreciate the candor and openness with which you gentlemen have been speaking to us, and Vice President Mondale, thank you for being you and for holding us all to a higher standard. Thank you very much.